Thank you all for being here today. We'd like to especially thank the clans of the Aquan for their protection and their ownership of the place in which we're presenting today. We'd also like to thank the organizers of the conference as well for making it possible to make this presentation. The matters that we're discussing today, the historical events that will be discussed in our presentation, occurred over 140 years ago, and the relations amongst the people at that time do not bear on the current relations between the Hunakawu and the Tsimshian people. And Ken will have more comment on that as we go forward. We would like to acknowledge the following individuals who have contributed generously of their knowledge and time. We will be hearing from Ken Grant, Takdentan Shadahani later, discussing the clan information. I've also would like to thank and acknowledge Alan John Martin. John is here, and Mrs. Martin is here. Al was unable to join us. I'd like to acknowledge both of them for their contributions. We'd like to acknowledge Richard Dalton, whose words were recorded by myself and Chuck Smythe many years ago, and that oral tradition, demonstration of the power of those oral tradition and the reason why they should be cherished and preserved. You'll see. And I've received some funding by the Tower Endowment Grant to look at the British Columbia side of this question. So here's the overview of our presentation. The basic thrust is to present information concerning events in 1880 when Hunna Tlingit protested to the U.S. Navy about Tsimshian sea otter hunting on Hunna grounds on the outer coast above Cape Spencer. We'll proceed to talk briefly about the environmental characteristics of the land and ocean, brief discussion of the evidence of the archaeological evidence of occupation and use on the outer coast. Then we'll turn with Ken to talk about Takdentan ancestry and the establishment of territories Atu on the outer coast, both in land and sea. We'll talk then about Takdentan use of the offshore waters, especially the Fairweather Grounds. We'll then turn to discuss the historical background on Hunna sea otter trading and relations with Tsimshians, where special recognition to Richard Dalton will be given. Then we'll turn to discuss the events of 1880 in terms of the U.S. Navy visit to Hunakawu and meeting with the Hunna chiefs, and their written statements about how they actually interacted with the Hunna people at that time. And finally, we'll take up the issues of the significance of those events and the Navy statements made at that time. So this is taken from the clan map to show the general territory of the Hunakawu and one of the historic primary villages. And here's the basic region that we're talking about. It constitutes the one of the areas of traditional territory of the Takdentan from Cape Spencer to Cape Fairweather. And I want you to place this little this little map in mind, because that yellow line that you see up there offshore, that's the 3-mile limit, and the brown line is the 12-mile territorial sea, as it is now occupied. And as you can see, Fairweather Grounds sit outside that. So this is what we mean by offshore waters then. This is what we're talking about, not the coastal zone, but the zone at a distance. And further, you'll also see the line of the continental shelf. On the land, the Cape Spencer to Cape Fairweather is divided basically into 2 zones. A relatively complex coastline in the south, and a relatively straight coastline in the north. The Fairweather Range, and particularly Mount Fairweather, are prominent features of the land throughout this entire area. On the southern end, there are fjords and bays from Cape Spencer to Icy Point, with steeply rising mountains of the Fairweather Range, very short streams in this area. In the north end, there are straight exposed shorelines with little shelter, with numerous glaciers and steep mountains. Very, very significant in the ancestry and use and occupancy of the area by Langdon is Lituya Bay or Lituya, where it was important for seals, salmon, and sea otter. There are throughout the area a few small sockeye streams in the southern bays, which were owned by house groups of the Langdon. The region lies on the Fairweather Fault and is subject to earthquakes and tectonic uplift through the centuries, which has impacted the way in which archaeological evidence of occupation has to be pursued. The ocean characteristics, heard Fred mention the Alaska current in this most northerly portion of southeastern Alaska. For some reason it occurs on the charts as the California current, which runs from south to north, producing the same kind of uplift in very important nutrient production for primary productivity. The Fairweather Grounds, a central point and node of our discussion, are raised banks offshore between Lituya Bay and Icy Point. These are shallow grounds of high productivity for fish. Prior to World War II, there were some commercial halibut fishing area, but it was only at that time that you began to see the commercial trolling fleet come into the knowledge of that particular area as being a node in which the salmon coming out of the North Pacific gyre would cross over the Fairweather Grounds as they began to come into shore. Of course, this was long recognized and understood by Tlingit before that time in terms of the significance of that area to salmon. The continental shelf to the west drops off sharply just west of the Fairweather Grounds. So we have the Fairweather Grounds here and the continental shelf. So this juxtaposition is really good for primary productivity. The tidal movements and the wind in this region produced rough water, and because of the shallowness of the Fairweather Grounds, huge waves will build up, just like at the mouth of the Columbia River and other places. So this is a feature, environmental feature of the region that is also something that we'll see some interesting cultural points about later on. Here we have the traditional Huna territory with the approximate territories of the clans, and in this particular map you can see Langdon territorial holdings include all of the region that is under discussion where we are today. Now when we turn to examine the kind of environmental information that comes from this particular zone, and since we're particularly talking in part about sea otters, but we'll also discuss the other significant species that are of importance to Langdon in the offshore waters. The one, first of all, that we'll discuss is the, you want to say that for me? The sea otter name. Yeah. Yes, that's the sea otter term, and the place. Yeah, this is Yokcheani, which is the land of the sea otter, the entire Fairweather coast in the Langdon conceptualization. And at the north end of their territory is a term, Yokchehini, which also speaks to the presence of the sea otters throughout this zone. Now we're going to take a look at the evidence of the Tlingit settlement place names. There are other place names as well, but these three come down through history and down to this day in terms of how people associate their own lineages to these three areas. And particularly the second one, Kanaha-an, is very, very important in terms of the continuing cultural heritage, the Atu of the Langdon people. Now, there are also Tlingit place names associated with the ocean on the outer coast. One of these is Yeltut, which is the black raven, and this references the ocean waves and is one of the critical terms associated with Tuktintan territorial claim. The second, which is most significant in the context of the discussion today, is a term that is translated as the out-of-breath, exhausted fur seal grounds. And this represents, is the term used, as Ken will talk about, the oral term used to talk about Fairweather Grounds by the Landgdon people. So if you begin to think, well, how did that name come about? Well, we'll get to that in a little bit. Now, the archaeological investigations between Cape Spencer and Icy Point have revealed a number of evidences of the occupation of the region that are related to the oral traditions in the communities. The recent limited, and I say limited because it was really classed as only a kind of a survey area, and it was conducted only between Icy Point and Cape Spencer. That document gives the following information, which is that there are 4 sites that clearly have evidence of pre-contact human occupation, and they seem to be associated with the place names of the villages that were out there. The first site, Cocknoo Creek 1, was an established village at the time of contact, and it occupied. Cocknoo Creek simply refers, this is archaeological terminology for where the site is located. That's not a Landgdon term. The evidence from that site shows 400 years prior to contact. It's usually in the form of a charcoal remains associated with hearths, and there are some evidences of very limited kinds of faunal remains associated with any of these sites. Now, on a raised terrace opposite shore, they're called 1 and 2 because they're on opposite shores of the creek. There's a second occupation that occurred between, that's translated to BC. You need to add about 2,000 years to it to get to what's called before present. So that site was occupied in the neighborhood between 5,000 and 4,900 years ago. The second site, probably associated with the village, is called Willioughby Bay, which was occupied approximately at 1500 AD, and then the site well known to people who continued to use this particular site well into the 20th century. At Point Villaguena was occupied in the evidence in the 16th and 17th centuries. So that's all archaeological evidence that specifically indicates pre-contact occupation in that area. Would like to turn now to the Landgdon ancestry, and I'm going to turn in a moment to Ken to talk about these aspects of the heritage and the claims of the Landgdon people. I'll simply mention here at the outset that their oral tradition has 2 accounts of ancestral clan emergence, both of which place them on the outer coast in the Lituya Bay area, and also in a close kinship relationship with the Lutnachari clan as well, as part of that tradition. 2 important Atu memorialize their emergence: the blanket and the Sea Otter tunic. We'll talk more about Sea Otter shortly. And subsequent historical events of significance on the outer coast, especially Mount Fairweather, are memorialized in numerous clan Atu. So, Ken.
Noble people, Anetkusani is the way we say it, I'm thinking, Anetkusani. But I know there are some eagles out there. I see my close cousin sitting right here, Wushkitan. I see a grandchild, Wushkitan out there, and Kagwantan, and there may be others in the eagle side, but another one here waved his hand. Which clan are you? Yanyedi. Oh, are you from inland?
From Taku.
Oh, Kanachish. I'm glad you're here. We always say I'm really pleased to see you here. But I also would like to acknowledge some of the Raven side. I see the Nata sitting back there, Ethel Mackinnon, Gulichish, Kautuhin, my grandson here.
Of course.
Gulichish, and I see David Light over here. Connachtedi. Yeah, good. And my cousin sitting here, I mentioned the other day that the president signed an order to change McKinley to Denali. So my cousin now is Al McKinley became Al Denali. So yeah, I'm talking about the authenticity of the outer coast and the Taklin Khan. Most of what I've got, I've been working at the Park Service, and I'm translating a lot of the oral histories, thanks to the Sea Alaska Heritage, Nora Marks, all the works that they've done. And I've been able to acquire a lot of the oral histories by very knowledgeable elders who have now left us. In our culture, we say "Yaktas Wichik." They got on their canoes and left us now. But fortunately, I've been able to hear their voices and to translate it, and I've got quite a number of translations already done, and some of it I will refer to here. On the oral histories, growing up in our home, we were a pretty traditional family. I know that Western forces had already come in, the churches came in, schools came in, and boarding schools came in. But fortunately, my grandfather and my grandmother didn't speak English. So, and my dad required us, us boys, we had to go to our grandparents' house every day, or literally we had to pick out a stick from the woodpile, and he literally spanked us. And I've got lots of marks on my elbows, trying to protect myself from my dad. But that's how it was when we were kids. And now some of you may remember that out there. I see some people that probably lived in that time frame. But I think I was very fortunate having grandparents that didn't speak English, and we had to be there all day long. So when we walked through that door, speaking English, our grandmother would hit us on the rear and say, speak Tlingit. So we shifted gears. And, anyway, but most of the stories that I heard from my grandparents, my grandfather was about Mount Fairweather and the outer coast. They always talked about, my grandfather talked about halibut fishing out there with canoes. And he talked about the Sea Otter hunting out there. So much of the validation that I have are from personal knowledge, but I've also had, I've translated some stories that were sort of a sidebar, but it included the outer coast, one by Willie Marks, Kityanai. He talked about Kuchkasak, but Kuchkasak is a story that if I got into that, we'd use up the whole time period here, but it's actually where people went up into Mount Fairweather in spirit quest to become a Yicht. Anyway, Kuchkasak, just very briefly, he was working, he was a young man. His uncle was out there, and his uncle's wife were out in the outer coast. They were smoking all sorts of meat, mountain goat, seal, you name it, they were smoking it. And he was a young kid and he was hungry. And he saw that, you know, they had the mountain goat meat hanging in the smokehouse. And when you smoke the meat, it gets dark, of course, and the fat hanging on gets dark. And he broke a piece off. He couldn't resist, he was so hungry. He put it in his mouth and ate it. And the wife of the uncle was very strict. My mother describes her as very mean, really. And I've known people like that in our culture. They're really strict. But she saw what happened and she gouged his mouth out, and he went wandering out. He took his uncle's, some of his uncle's things and went wandering off. But I'm really cutting this one short because I know we're on the time frame. But as he wandered out, he went to Anaha. Went to Anaha. And Anaha was the name of the village that was there. We always name villages after a river. Chukanahini, Patini, Anahahini. That's the way we name a lot of our villages. But he went out there. But the point I'm making here is it's different stories of our school. And the important thing, and I'll start this all over again because George Dalton talks about the same story. No, that's the, I've got it mixed up now. Okay, we're talking about Kupkasa. He went out there. And Willie Marks talked about this going out there too, the story. But the other story is called Kakerte, the man who killed sleep. I see John Martin out there. I know he knows these stories. My older brother out there. Kakerte. I know it's pronounced several different ways by different authors that write the orthography for it. But I listened to George Dalton when he talked about it, and he literally says Kakerte, and I've seen it written in Swanton as Kakeklutit, and I can accept both of them. I think Kakerte was the way George Dalton pronounced it. He talks about the place Nagukehin was where our people migrated out there in the springtime, and that's out there by Cape Spencer, Villanueva. I think Steve mentioned it here, and it's a pretty interesting place. And Wayne Howell recently went out there and they found evidence of houses there and culturally marked trees. And so anyway, that's where George Dalton begins the story about Kakerte. A lot of you might have heard the story Kakerte. Anybody here? It's the man who killed sleep. The man who killed sleep. There's some people have heard about that there. And well, George Dalton talks about Nagukkean. Nagukkean. The small Nagukkean. He talks about where people migrate out, and our people went out into the grounds, to Fairweather Grounds, to hunt sea otters. But that's where they were settled right there, and they went out and something came to him at night, was flying in front of him, and he knocked it down with an oar, canoe oar, and the creature died. The next morning when he woke up, the eyes were puffed out, there was blood coming out, and he tried to wake his crewmen, and they also perished. He went back to the village, and no one was alive. Everybody was gone. But know this is a really interesting story, but I'm going to have to rush along here. Anyway, what he did was he wandered up into the outer coast that he wanted to Anaha into. He wanted there. And the point of the story is our oral histories go through there, and we had residents out there by Cape Spencer. Anaha was another place we lived, and then to Lituya Bay. The person that I got the most out of from oral history was Mary Wilson's story. She's a grandmother, and there was her real good recording by Sea Alaska Heritage. I was able to get that and translated, and she goes into great detail about our people being out there in Lituya Bay. There are many stories out there, but she tells about our hunters going out. They kide has na hochtin, kolun katshakti. That's the way they say it. They canoed way out into the ocean. And there are a lot of stories about our weather people that give the go-ahead to go out there. But the main point I want to make here is our people were out there, and they hunted. First they hunted sea otters, seal, and they fished for halibut, and they fished for salmon up there. So they used it. Yan has that's the way we say it in our culture. They were settled in there, same time, almost settled in up there. And, so we used the land. We went outshore, and I know Steve's going to bring up some points that were made by my brother John over there and L. Martin, so I won't go into that. But Mary Wilson went into that story, and she said they went out there and they which means exhausting, which Steve mentioned a while ago. They surrounded the balloon and they wore it out until they can capture it. And, that's the way. And out there they divided up the resources that they gathered, and they always say what did it say? There's a term for it. It escapes me right now. But anyway, they divided these things up, and by the time they came to the shores, they distributed the food amongst the people on the shore there. And Mary Wilson said they always celebrate. Lots of songs when they're coming to shore. It was a big celebration. They celebrate when they come to shore with all the foods. But I think I better hurry up now. I think we've got, and there are a lot of oral histories, and I translated a lot of them, and they're both an HIA, one Indian Association, and the Park Service has it. So if you wanted to get some of those, you'll have to go through them. Okay. But I have here, what I want to do is oral history and songs. How much time do I have? Go ahead.
Go ahead, about
Yeah.
half hour.
Oh, got lots of time.
Deal go like that.
Yeah. Well, you'll see up here some very, very sacred hats, and they're very spiritual, and if they're not handled properly, kasetsiko is the way we say it in our culture. And I know John is hit over there. The hats are very sacred, and if they're not handled properly, we pay consequence of some kind. And we have songs that go with them, and stories that go with them. On the left, on your left here, you'll see there's a hat that we call Shatapan Shao, it's Ahu, or a lot of us refer to simply Fairweather hat. And there are stories that go with it. This one here goes with a man decided to become a shaman, And he went through rituals before going up on the mountain. He went out into the outer coast, and he fasted and did things that they do up the mountain. And I'll really cut this one short. This is a very sacred story. And in the English language, they say it's esoteric. Esoteric. I mean, can you hear me back there? I know my voice is not very strong, so it's esoteric. But Ajal was the one that went up the mountain, and he was on the spirit quest. There's actually a story that comes before this one. But because of the order that they're sitting, I'll go ahead and do it. He went up to the mountain, and as he lay sleeping, he came to. He woke up, and he saw this dog. The dog was looking at him. And he tried to talk to the dog. He tried to call it like and you heard the Glacier Bay story. Gates, gates, gates. Just the way they called dogs in those days. But the dog didn't respond. And finally the dog asked him, Gudesua iatan. Gudesua iatan. Where are you going? Where are you going? If they I want to go down to the shore now. See, when he saw this thing, that's when he became Icht. This was the spirit quest. And that's the story about the dog on the other side there. That's the dog he saw there. It's the story about that. And we have songs about it, and they're very spiritual songs, and they're only done on very special occasions. You just don't do it anytime, and you don't. In fact, it's being displayed now, and I had a little difficulty with that, I know, because we don't display them. We keep them hidden, and we bring them out for healing. When someone passes away, we bring them out for healing. And I see my brother walking up there. Anyway, I told you part of when Ajog was up there. When he was coming down, he heard music, he heard singing, and yeah, he's going to stand with us. He heard singing, and here come these women. They came out of Gatuk, maybe forest, maybe wilderness, maybe the fog. These women came out and they were singing, and they were swaying. And a lot of our women do that nowadays. They sway, and they have one dog. It's an ermine that hangs down that came out there. And that's the tradition we have right now. That's the tradition. Our Continental women get to wear one ermine on one side, and they come out and do the sway song. And there's two stories, and another one that Lil White tells. She said, hey, Joe, the one I mentioned earlier, was sitting on the shore. He was already a shaman. I think he was sitting on probably off of Lituya Bay, looking up at Mount Fairweather, and all of a sudden there was trembling. There was trembling he looked at Mount Fairweather, and the door Mount Fairweather opened up, and out of it came the women doing the same thing. So there's two stories that go to it. Anyway, that I think I've covered both of them now, the Fairweather and the dog. The middle one, there's a story that goes with it. How much time do I have?
This story for sure. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. The middle one is a seagull hat. I really like this hat because it shows a nest with a little one in there. To me, I think our elders were thinking of our children and grandchildren when they made this hat. And I think it's very symbolic to have that nest with a little one in there. But this hat was actually carved in Sitka. We had Daktain Tan over there, and the name escapes me right now. The man, John Lawrence, is that, you will see a Daktain Tan? Well, anyway, there's a man had it carved in Sitka, and he brought it to, and when he passed away, J.C. Johnson went over, he was instructed by the person that had it carved in Sitka to come over and bring it to Huna. So they brought it to Huna, and but there's a seagull hat song that goes. J.C. Johnson composed the seagull hat song, and that goes with it. But I was told by Little White, my daughter, Gates. Oh, she was a great historian. She pounded into our heads. She's actually Chulkan Shah, but she's a child of Daktain Tan. Her father, J.C. Johnson, told her the stories, and she really drove these things home, these stories about these things. And the blanket underneath is a chilkat blanket that goes with the dog. And the dog, she said, was so powerful. The spirit of this dog was very powerful. That when they brought it in and they moved amongst the audience literally ducked down, and how strong that spirit was. And the other thing about the dog is that the mouth does open, but it's only done when a real high upper leader passes away, but it's never done for anybody else. So when the leader dies, and there's a song that goes with it, and I'm telling you, it's a powerful song, and we'll do it. We'll learn this song, and we'll do it when we open up the tribal house in Glacier Bay. We'll do that. And I think I've used up all of my time. But just to go back, we have oral histories documented out there. There's a lot of it, a lot of oral histories. We have songs that go with it. And the one that I want to mention, and I want to recognize the co-host over here, and the Sockeye over here. We were all out there together, that's the way we know it, and we heard that we were one, Kate Hati and us. And the song that I want to bring to your attention is called the Wave Song. Teach, Guti Achen Atat. We lived out there in Lituya Bay. I say we, and I'm including the co-hosts and the Sukha, these two, that we lived out there. And one day, face of the mountain broke off, crashing down into the water, and it washed our people offshore, out into the Black Raven. It's a powerful story. We have that song, and the way the story goes. Some of our people were drowned. Some of them were hanging on to other people that were dead. And the song that we have about it, the women, when they're singing, there's a part where they go in and they go down towards the ground like that. And that part there is when our people were drowning out there. And we call it adu when we pay for things. Like Glacier Bay, the woman that was left behind was adu. We paid for it with the life of a woman. And when our people got washed out into the ocean, people drowned out of Lituya Bay, we paid for it too. And I want to make sure that people know But we lived out there. It's, the wave song is really powerful. And, when we dedicate the tribal house, I'm pretty sure this will be part of the dedication too. And I know John here, and I really appreciate him coming up and standing with. I know he's got a lot of stories, and Steve's got lots more to do. So,
Come and see. Did you win, John? I'm here to support Kenny and his stories. And what Sea Alaska's done is to perpetuate the clans. But a lot of the stories are incomplete yet. And I'm here to support documentation by Steve Langdon. And I just want to make sure that we don't have a picture of my clan hat. It's the Raven hat coming from Lituya Bay. The original lineage of our clan house, the Sockeye House. And so the reason why we take ownership, and our history talks about creation. And creation began at Mount Fairweather. And I just love to listen to additional creation stories. But as far as I know, we're the only ones that speak about creation in Mount Fairweather. And so we live near this upper Sockeye Street in Lituya Bay. So that's where we received our name, Duckdeku'u, Duckdane Ton. Similar to the people of Saudan. It's a misnomer when they named those Tlingits from Sundom. They couldn't have the Tlingit tone sounds. So when the anthropologists were told that they were, the people from Sundom were named Saudan Ku'u, the people by the green water. So it's a misspelling. So they called it Sudan, and it turned out to be Sundom. And inaccuracy, we understand, but we don't mock, and we're not impolite. At least we have some documentation. So the reason why I'm here to support Steve and Brother Kenny is the reason why we acknowledge the Kobos, their grandchildren. I called the Yakutat about the outside song, the gift that was given supposedly to the Kobos, the outside song. Beautiful song. And it's actually designed to acknowledge the children of the coastal area. The Athabascan were trying to infiltrate the outside area, so somehow or other they didn't accomplish that. But they did give songs to the people of the coast. So when I called help me out, brother, on the Koho leader, George Remus.
yes.
I called George Remus in lieu of respect. And he said, in Tlingit, you don't need to ask me. He said, it was quiet, mainly because I think that I caught him off guard. He had to recoup his spirit. I think there might have been a tear that was rolling off his cheek. He said, I'm surprised. He said, Ushtinea Hatisi. Achawa Aktu Kaisitsak. Hasis Bahasaya Ushtin Hasudine. Stua. Yati Jaya Yajinistan Sakatuhan Hashipuni, Yakas Kauzitak, Achia Jayakuk to shot. What he was saying is, there were only 2 people saved after the last tsunami on that island. When you called, he said, my thoughts were that it seems like I can still hear the cries, our grandfather's cries echoing in the mountain. So he said, one of the leaders was Koho Tuknakadi, and the other leader was Daktentan. After the clans perpetuated, they eventually started moving south. Along the way, they eventually ended up in Taylor Bay, Point Corellis, Yashagoan, and also right into Bartlett Cove, Dundas Bay area. So that song that was developed was mourning not just the Daktentan, but the Kolos. So we sing the same song, as Ethel McKinnon knows, that she eventually she had a CD of correcting some of these songs. So I want to just make sure that I'm here to support that along the way that because of survival and the hunting grounds that Steve is actually documenting on Mount Fairweather, Middleton Island, and along the coast. And we appreciate all the work that Steve has completed. And my sister-in-law is here, Margaret. Margaret, would you stand? This is Al Martin's wife. And we know the stories. Brother Al, I don't think could make it, but his daughter is here, Caroline. Usually, on an occasion like this, initially that most of the Daktentan, probably the Coles, we should have a panel and acknowledge them, not to say that we reinvent the history. I didn't reinvent the stories. These are the stories that were handed down to me. My wife's grandfather, Albert Jackson, Charlotte Grogan. He's the one that told these stories that were subordinate from Lituya Bay. And that's why they carry the Lituya Bay, Mount Fairweather hat, the Raven hat. So I want to thank that. I'm taking too much time, but I want to make sure sometimes, because of respect, that you have to, when you do support, we know the stories. So we're happy to share that with you out of respect. Thank you, Steve and Kenny.
Thank you, John. Little Chief for the support. We're just going to move ahead with some of these remarks. We may carry over a little bit. This is an old image that was actually taken by Louis Shotridge, a man who hasn't yet been identified, and he's likely wearing a sea otter cloak. And it's an early indication of that this is in fact the cloaks that are brought out and worn by Daktentan men. These are Atu, associated of the Daktentan clan. And they're referred to as the Actrait du Hu, which are placed on the Daktentan men by men from the invited clans prior to the beginning of wake ceremonies. This I'm going to go through very quickly. In 1904 or around 1900, a number of facial paintings images were collected by John Swanton, and a number of the ones that are associated with Daktentan are related to these particular stories that we have been hearing. Although they're very difficult perhaps to discern because of them, he had precise labels for them. So here we have one that depicts the black raven, another one that shows to show the steepness of the waves offshore where sealing took place, the Fairweather Ground type waves. the canoes coming out of Lituya Bay, the puffins, which play a very important role in Clan Atu as well. And here, of course, is the most important, if we would, in terms of its spiritual ties. And we are, of course, offshore here in this picture, looking at this most important, not absolutely, but significant crest. And there are face paintings that depict this mountain when it's clear and when it's also in altered states, that are all part of, when people put on face paintings, they're representing themselves and their heritage to others. And here are a number of other ones. This one relates on the far, on the right that you're seeing, to one of the hats that Ken discussed, and some final ones as well, all of which come from more detailed assessment of those later on. This one deals with the raven and the importance of tidal change, another very significant part of Danton tunics and oral tradition, and also the king salmon story of acquiring king salmon on the other. All very extraordinary. This is a phrase that Ken used earlier. Our grandfathers traveled far offshore to catch all of these materials. And in addition, Al added on, they also fished for red rockfish and sablefish. And furthermore, that there are scallops in the region around Fairweather Grounds, which can be eaten by sea otters. So the duck dam utilization of the Fairweather Grounds, we can see in various different aspects of the practice. How location was used. So when the men were offshore, they would use what we call triangulation techniques, in which they would orient to Mount Fairweather and to another point to see what distance they were. They used also triangulation for fishing spots, how you would actually be on the grounds where you wanted to get halibut. They used it for determining distance. And the top of Mount Fairweather played extremely important in terms of being able to understand. And I want to thank John and Al for that particular information, very important. They would range north and south on the outer grounds as long as that mountaintop was visible to them, very important. And they would determine depths on the Fairweather Grounds by using a sea lion skin line to make soundings, and we'll look at some of that here briefly. I had constructed, this is what is called a view shed, so that if you were at the top of Mount Fairweather, these are the distances from which you can look out into the ocean. So by inversion, this far off you can in fact see, and that radius is 150 miles. 150 miles offshore is possible with that, using that particular guidance. And this is just to show that the Earth's curvature has an impact. And Ken is a long-distance fisherman. He has some wonderful comments on what it's like to be out there when you don't have that as a guidance too, so that's wonderful. The pinnacles in the Fairweather Grounds are really important and were named by the men later on. There are two locations here called, there's a 13-foot spot right here and the 16-foot spot. Those are the shallowest areas. And when we were talking in our meeting, when we were discussing this, Al and John and myself, I used this particular sketch. You recall this sketch, John, as a prop for understanding some of those relations. And when I first drew it, it had the water line and the mountain line, and then through the comments I could draw the line at the bottom showing how you could see east and west. And then in the middle, there was nothing on, and then in the middle of it, these two dots, these were drawn by Al on that particular map that I had drawn. And those two dots correspond with the pinnacles and how they are thought about in terms of the offshore waters. Quite clear, traditional, and carried on knowledge for a long time. The weather, the face of Mount Fairweather is very important for the men offshore to track the weather and when they need to be careful out there. The practices that we discussed, the way in which the fur seal were hunted out there. and similar techniques in terms of exhausting the animals through continuous pressure on them was reported for taking sea otters. I want to touch now on the actual physical evidence about the sea otters and the fur seals. This is the historic range of sea otters. And I want to note the offshore occupations in Haida Gwaii, the Pribilof Islands, Santa Barbara Islands. The map does not show that they also occupied Middleton Island, Wessel's Reef, which is just west of this territory. Here are the sea otters. They are abundant in many areas of southeast, and their eating habits seriously impacting subsistence resources in many villages. Won't have anything more to say on that front today. It's another topic, but here is recent research documenting males' diving propensities, quite interestingly, in locations quite nearby at Idaho Inlet and Port Alfred. The sea otter males regularly dive to 50 fathom depths to get their food, and on occasion up to 80 fathoms in depth. And so when we look at the circumstances in terms of the 50 fathom lines, what we can see is that much of that very readily available feeding area, the 50 fathom line, is out here on the shore. Plus, most importantly, there's also a significant amount. And if you went to 80 fathoms, virtually all of those grounds now would be available in terms of where sea otters would find themselves. There are also some very interesting stories about the use of offshore waters by the sea otters. When sea otters are under heavy predation, they relocate to locations where the pressure is reduced. In other parts of Alaskan waters, we find that in the Bering Sea, north of where the Aleut hunting occurred, under extreme hunting pressure, a population of sea otters became pelagic. That means that they stayed offshore in the early 1800s, and they lived from 3 to 50 miles offshore of Unimak Island. And in the Gulf of Alaska, where the Alutiiq hunted, south of Prince William Sound, in the day, the sea otters go offshore, often 30 miles or more to sleep, so they wouldn't be easily accessible. The natives know the feeding grounds. Sometimes they paddle offshore to these and remain there all night so as to be on the spot early, as soon as they can see. More often they camp on shore and leave in time to reach the feeding grounds by 3 a.m., often having to paddle 10 miles or more offshore to do this. Fur seals. Fascinating what I discovered in reading this is that they seem to time their northward migration following the outer continental shelf was 30 to 40, such that they arrive off Sitka at herring spawning time. That's pretty good, huh? That's when they arrive there before then continuing on north. And that's when Tom Thornton has recorded stories with Herman Kitka that the fur seals will move sometimes into the bays at that time as well. And this little one here, the way in which that fur seal plinkets have a particular, they use hand signals to show different forms out in the water, and they will use this signal to talk about fur seals like that, to show that particular position. This just shows how they move it on the return. I couldn't find a northward migration. So when a sea otter trading goes back a long ways, in their own time, in pre-contact time, trading was going on. Garments were important everywhere. Archaeological evidence shows in various middens through time that there are sea otter remains. 1788 was the first exchange in which a British captain acquired sea otters in trade offshore just south of Icy Point. The sea otter trade increased dramatically, but by 1815 numbers had declined. However, beginning then between 1830 and 1865, the Hudson's Bay Company sent vessels Beaver and La Bouchère to Hunakawu to trade for skins. One of the sites of this trade was Swanson Harbor, which is on the north side, east at the very configuration of Icy Strait and Lynn Canal. And of course, they would trade also to Russian Americans. Following the assumption of jurisdiction by the United States, the Hudson's Bay Company vessels could no longer trade in Alaska waters. I don't have time to talk about the whole history, but I'd like to, now to relate the information from the deceased and my dear and good friend Richard Dalton, who is no longer with us. And if you look at that point, is Sea Point your fishing point you're at? Is that your? That's, okay. This is when the three of us were out there documenting the fishing locations in the Indian Islands. The Tsimshians were close associates of the Hudson Bay Company at Port Simpson. And this new opening for trade emerged with the Hudson's Bay Company since they couldn't come up. They apparently used the opportunity to establish trade relations with Dundas Bay Duck Den Tom. They may have accompanied the Hudson's Bay Company in the earlier years to make some of those initial contacts. The oral history that Richard Dahl provided was that this was established of a traditional relationship based upon respectful gift giving and generous hosting. This was followed by trade of arms, which the Hudson's Bay Company would bring, which were superior arms for Southeast people to what the Russians could provide in exchange for the sea otter skins. He stated that that particular Tsimshian leader with the name came to Dundas Bay and was especially interested in Nagoon berries, and he initiated the trade with Richard's grandfather, Tinkata. Later on, a visit of 8 Tsimshian canoes to Puna to meet with the leader and the transfer of special cultural valuables from the Tsimshians. These events likely occurred in this time frame after the U.S. jurisdiction, and this was being pursued as indigenous people, native people, Tsimshian people to each other, carrying on the ancient traditions of trade without regard to state jurisdiction. And this then in 1880 is the oldest chart that we have of Puna. And even in 1880, what I would just point out from this chart, there were at least 10 houses established on the shore of Gadakan, of Hunia at that particular time, which is an indication of the wealth that had been generated by the sea otter trade for the Duck Den Ton and their other clan members. This is a picture made by the Northwest Trading Company. In 1880, they opened a trade post that was there very shortly. And this is of Puna, and it's the only picture that I know of that demonstrates a well-known evidence in the record of Tlingit people building palisades as a form of nuch and protection. It was still in place at that time. So let me talk now about the events of 1880 with the U.S. Navy. The relations with the Tsimshian apparently had changed, for grounds we don't know. Rather than trading, Tsimshians began hunting sea otters on their own under unclear circumstances. In February of 1880, the Huna chiefs traveled to Sitka, and while there, left their complaints to the naval commander at that time, Lester Beardsley, about Tsimshians hunting on their grounds. In late June, 3 canoes of Tsimshians arrived at Point Adolphus, and they passed by the Northwest Trading Company vessel there on their way west. On July 11th, the Huna chiefs directed the local store and prospector Willioughby to write a letter to Beardsley in which they informed him of the situation and asked what Beardsley would do to get the Tsimshians off their hunting grounds. On July 21st, the Northwest Trading Company men observed the Tsimshian canoes on their way out of the area going home. On August 4th, the Northwest Trading Company gave a note to Beardsley and Sitka reporting the Hunas openly stated that their intention was to take and kill the entire Fort Simpson expedition on their return from the Sea Otter grounds. Beardsley met with Treasury Special Agent Morris, and they decided to go to Icy Straits and meet with the chiefs to avert conflict. They chartered the Northwest Trading Company Favorite, armed it with howitzers, and put 10 Navy crewmen aboard. They traveled north to Icy Strait, where they met with 3 what they called chiefs on the vessel Favorite on Tasda, anchored by Tasda, Limeshore Island. Both of the American representatives spoke with the chiefs, and they relate in their special memos what they said. And they were particularly impressed by the oldest spokesman, who apparently had convinced the other Huna not to kill the Tsimshians. So we have one voice that was very, very significant. Beardsley wrote that the Tlingit leaders informed them that the Tsimshians were on their hunting grounds 30 miles northwest of Cape Spencer. all of the territorial waters that we've been referenced constitute their hunting ground. This is that vessel, the Favorite, which was outfitted and charged by the government, which came to that particular meeting. And the Huna at the meeting told Beardsley that they had told him that they would return in September to hunt again with 50 canoes armed by the Hudson's Bay Company and supported by the Fort Simpson missionaries. The Tsimshians said they were Boston men, said that Boston men had no authority over them because they were King George men, and they paid the U.S. Navy no mind. Beardsley recognized the Huna territorial claim to their hunting grounds, which had been violated in his writing while advising against violence. Morris also told them not to fight, but he also told them that if he found them with goods obtained from the Hudson Bay Company, he would confiscate them as contraband. In his report to Navy Secretary Thompson, Beardsley stated that the Tsimshians were on the Tlinkits hunting grounds without authorization and they should not be there. In his report to Thompson, Morris noted that Tsimshians were using guns, which was a violation of the law of 1877, in addition to their status as foreigners. Both were convinced that the situation was extremely serious and wrote they expected a war in which the 800 Hunas would face off against 2,000 Tsimshians. Morris held a similar view. Beardsley was further concerned that this could lead to hostilities between the United States and Great Britain. Both men reported they would write letters to Hudson's Bay Company factors, to the missionary, and to the BC Commissioner of Indian Affairs, J.W. Powell. In September, prior to leaving his reassignment, Beardsley wrote a letter summarizing his activities on the matter, which included the following statement. The Tsimshians did not return to Hunakahu in the fall and did not subsequently come to Hunakahu, but in the next decade they began an engagement with the Yakutat Tlinkits, which is another story. This is Commander Beardsley's advice to the Secretary of Navy Thompson in September 1880. On the right you can see that's his handwriting. On the left is the translation of it. In the event of the expected war this fall, I shall simply act as an advisor to the Indians, urge them not to go to war but to wait patiently until the letters I have written upon the subject shall have been received in Washington. The next phrase is telling. I shall not tell them not to fight, for I am utterly unable to see that my orders are carried out, and so do not carry weakness. We'll not go into any exegesis on the meaning of that right now, but that should be resonating in people's minds. This is the Jamestown which he would not bring up because it lacked the kind of mobility. That's why they brought the other one up there. So what are the considerations here? Briefly, the Huna want to assert their territorial claims and rights and to maintain their rights to hunt and trade the sea otters. The Tsimshians, for whatever reason, are now under the impression, and this is a very complex arrangement that bears greater discussion, but they were no longer trading and they wanted to acquire the sea otter skins to trade it for Fort Simpson for their own will. The Hudson's Bay Company wanted to maintain access to exceptionally high value sea otter skins, which were being priced at that time in the 1880s by HBC at between $120 and $200. So convert $120 in 1880 money to contemporary to get what one skin might have been worth, and while they're willing to make these ends to it, it's amazing. Of course, the Northwest Trading Company's interest is that they want to gain access to those sea otter skins for their own profit and well-being. Beardsley, who both Ken and I agree is a remarkable figure in U.S. Colonial history, sought to maintain peace and respect native rights. He operated on understandings associated with the notion of Indian country, which I won't talk in great detail about, in which the culture and political processes that were in place were to be largely left at home, only to be influenced if there were questions of peace. Finally, Morris's is a little more different. By the way, as a brief footnote, this is the guy who basically led to the bombing of Rangoon. Was this guy? I think everybody may recognize his name in that regard. But he always had a military. He's kind of the, well, that wouldn't be nice for me to make a political allusion to current populations. But at any rate, his idea was that assert U.S. sovereignty, close off the Hudson's Bay Company, enhance economic interests, and assert and exercise dominance over the Tlinkits. And it's clear in his reports that's what he was intent on. Beardsley, they're totally different people. We have these two U.S. people with entirely different sort of motivations and expressions. So to return to the question of jurisdictions, the U.S. Marine jurisdiction circa 1880 was out to 3 miles. In 1982, the U.S. asserted a territorial sea out to 12 miles. In 1983, the EEZ was established at 200 miles offshore. Now to turn to some significance for implications. ANCSA extinguished subsistence rights in Alaska. In 1971, Alaska meant land plus ocean out to 3 miles offshore. Thus, whatever Aboriginal rights offshore 3 miles have not been dealt with by the United States government. This is simply talks about how the U.S. asserted their jurisdiction over the EEZ. And then the implications of these events related to recent legal history. The St. Lawrence Island Yupik, indicated as Gamble, asserted Aboriginal rights in the EEZ were violated when their hunting outside 3 miles was ignored in an oil lease sale put on by the federal government. Legal decision in 1989 stipulated that Aboriginal rights were not precluded by a paramountcy doctrine and could coexist. No final decision was ever handed down in that case due to the withdrawal of the lease sale. In EAC 1, referred to in the legal literature as Trawler Diane, the Chugach villages from Prince William Sound to Titlik claimed concurrent fishing rights for halibut and sablefish in the EEZ on the grounds of unextinguished Aboriginal title. In 1998, the district court denied the rights on the basis of paramountcy. It did not cite Gamble because it was not an established opinion. But the judge on Trawler Diane said that the paramountcy doctrine precluded claims of Aboriginal rights. When this was appealed to the Ninth Circuit, they remanded it back down to the district on the basis that the determination about the Aboriginal status of those claims had not been made. So a second round of court cases was met. The district found that the Aboriginal rights did not exist as the Chugach had not met the legal requirements. On appeal at the Ninth Circuit decision, the Chugach lost by a very narrow 6-5 vote, 2012. The majority said that the Chugach had not proved exclusive use and occupancy, nor had demonstrated the capacity to exercise control over the claimed territory and exclude others using violence if necessary. The dissent in the case found that the Chugach had met the requirements for Aboriginal rights. The legal criteria for approving Aboriginal title. Claimants must prove that their holdings were actual, exclusive, and continuous use and occupancy for a long time of the claimed area. Use and occupancy are measured in accordance with the way of life, habits, customs, and usages of the Indians, who are its users and occupiers. What must be demonstrated through preponderance of evidence is that they were in a position to occupy or exercise exclusive control over the claimed area. They must exercise full dominion and control of the area such that it possesses the right to expel intruders and the power to do so. Chugach, it was determined, did not meet these exclusive control standards. To be continued. And that's the end of our presentation.